Reagan used to tell a story. He used to look out at his audiences and he'd say, I understand the frustration you feel when you're waiting in line to buy a hamburger and some young fellow is ahead of you buying a T-bone steak with food stamps. Right? Now, the first time he told this story, he didn't say some young fellow. He said some young buck, because he wanted to make sure, he didn't want to be too subtle, he wanted to make sure people get it, right? And young buck, right? This southern term that means a strong black man, usually one resistant to white authority, one who lusts after white women. Right? He used that term. Now, that wasn't a dog whistle. That was just naked racism. And he was roundly criticized for that story. So he dropped the term. Stopped saying some young buck. Started talking about some young fellow. And think about the racial imagery. It's not that blacks can't work. They're young. They're strong. They're healthy. They'd prefer not to work. They'd prefer to rip off the system. And in ripping off all the rest of us, they're living high off the hog. Right? That's the imagery of blacks. But of course, there's an imagery for whites there too. Because Reagan's talking to these white audiences and he's saying implicitly, I know you. You're hardworking. You're decent. You're law-abiding. You're playing by the rules. And because you're hardworking, decent, law-abiding, playing by the rules, you're struggling to make ends meet. I understand your struggle. And then there's a third character. And this is the crucial character. Government. Because it's government, Reagan is telling his audiences, it's government that's the real culprit here. Because it's government that refuses to control these minorities through lax enforcement of the criminal law, or in contemporary terms, lax enforcement of our immigration and borders with Mexico. It's government refuses to control them. And it's government that coddles them through welfare, through public spending, through education. And it's government that's reaching its hands into the pockets of the hardworking whites, taking out their hard-earned money and showering it on these undeserving minorities. And Reagan says, I know what we can do about this. I have a solution. What's the solution? Get government out of the way of the marketplace. Slash social spending, because it's just being wasted on minorities anyway. Cut taxes. Starve the beast. Starve government, right? And that last, cut taxes, because this is the hardest one to understand. What's the relationship between dog whistling and tax cuts? This is the connection. Cut taxes, because government's just wasting your hard-earned dollars on undeserving minorities. And Reagan did. Reagan cut taxes. Did those tax cuts go to the hardworking, law-abiding, struggling to make ends meet whites? No chance. The Reagan tax cuts over the 1980s transferred $1 trillion of wealth to the top 1%. And every decade since, those tax cuts have not been repealed. They've remained in place, and a further $1 trillion of wealth, plus, has been transferred to the top 1%, sold through a story that says, fear minorities, resent minorities, distrust government, defund government, get government out of the marketplace, get government out of social spending, cut taxes. And this is dog whistling. This is dog whistle politics. When you see that curve start to go up and the top 1% beginning to control more and more wealth in the country in 1980, that's done through a racial narrative. Through a racial narrative that says you're under threat from minorities, so you ought to despise government. Vote against it, right? This is dog whistle politics. This is what we've been living with. Now, some caveats. Well, before the caveats, I saw in the paper today that Maine and one other state are seeking to pass a law that would forbid welfare recipients from using food stamps to buy prime cuts of steak. This story hasn't gone away. This story is still part of the common sense narrative that people are talking about. This same stupid story about people on welfare buying T-bone steaks. Now you got a couple of states that are trying to pass a law to prevent it, as if it's a real problem, right? But it's not, it's the frame. Okay, caveats. One, this isn't a story only about race. I'm really hammering race because I think we need to understand how race is being used, but we should see that race is part of a larger culture war politics. In fact, once it's successful, almost simultaneously, but also once it's successful, conservatives come to see that they can pick up on other sorts of culture war threats and hammer at those. Threats to the traditional family, otherwise known as women moving out of the home. Threats built around abortion and contraception. Supposed threats built around homosexual marriage, or the disrespect of Christianity, or they're coming to take your guns, or they're coming to take your bullets, right? All of this sort of culture war politics is a narrative that conservatives have used, a drumbeat that says to Americans, focus on the most powerless, because they're eroding your status, they're eroding your position. Don't worry about the corporations and the top 1%. They're the job creators. Trust them. Fear these other marginal folks, right? That's the basic narrative. So, and race, I think it's primary there, but it's not race exclusively. Beyond culture war politics, if the basic message is fear government, the truth is there's lots of reason to fear government. This is a country that's just come out of the debacle of the Vietnam War, the tragedy of Watergate, right? In increasing now, if you bring it into contemporary terms, a lot of people do distrust government. This is the government that lied us into the war in Iraq. This is a government now that clearly seems to care more about the rich than about the rest of us. This is a government that seems dysfunctional. True, it's mainly the Republicans who are doing everything they can, the party of no, to make it dysfunctional, but still the government is dysfunctional. If the basic message is distrust government, for a lot of people that resonates. Completely apart from race, they see government as the problem in our lives. Last caveat. I'm talking throughout this about whites, white this, white that, the white voters. Let me double down on that. The Republican Party today draws 94% of its support from whites. 98% of its elected officials are white. Right? The country is 65% white. 94% of the support from Republicans comes from whites. 98% of their elected officials are white. They're whiter than most country clubs. How's that possible, right? Well, here's the caveat. When I say white, I don't mean people with fair features of European descent, because that's a way to understand white that is entirely superficial. I mean those people for whom a sense of their whiteness is integral to their self-conception. Sometimes that's conscious, right? Sometimes people consciously say, I'm white and I'm proud. Proud to be white. We built this country. But I think that's rare, right? I think that's rare. I think for most people, for most whites for whom whiteness is integral to their sense of self, it's operating more at the level of a subconscious understanding of society, of who belongs, of who's deserving, of who works hard, of who's lazy, who's criminal, who's diseased, who's an invader versus who's sort of an honored founder, right? Those narratives, you can have that whole conversation without mentioning race, and yet race is a clear and important subtext. It's those whites, I think, for whom these dog whistles are resonating. And when I say whites, I don't mean fair feature European descent. I mean people for whom their sense of being white is integral to their sense of where they fit in society, who's worthy of esteem in society, the history of the country, right, on that level. Okay, so those are the caveats. Caveats aside, we're really looking at a 50-year history of conservatives using race as a way to build electoral support for politicians who promised to dismantle the New Deal.